At the dawn of the 20th century, the world stood on the edge of a transformation so vast that no empire, however ancient, could escape its pull. Among these empires was the Ottoman Empire, a civilization that had ruled over vast lands for more than 6 centuries. By 1914, however, the empire was no longer the fearsome power that once dictated the fate of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. It was struggling to survive in a world reshaped by industrial warfare, nationalism, and global alliances. For Britain, the Ottoman Empire was both a relic of the past and a strategic puzzle of the future. The British Empire relied heavily on maritime dominance, and at the center of that dominance stood the Royal Navy. Control of sea routes meant control of trade, communication, and empire. Any shift in naval balance, especially in the Mediterranean and Near East, was viewed not merely as a military concern, but as a threat to Britain's global system. The Ottomans understood this reality all too well. Decades of decline had exposed the empire's weaknesses, particularly at sea. Once masters of the eastern Mediterranean, the Ottoman navy had fallen behind modern European fleets. Obsolete ships, limited industrial capacity, and political instability had left the navy unable to defend the empire's vast coastline or its critical waterways, including the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. The humiliation of naval weakness became undeniable during the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. Ottoman losses at sea demonstrated that without modernization, the empire would be defenseless in any future conflict. The leadership in Istanbul reached a sobering conclusion: survival required a modern navy, built quickly and with foreign assistance. Britain appeared, at first, to be the perfect partner. British shipyards were the most advanced in the world, producing revolutionary warships known as dreadnoughts, steel giants armed with heavy guns and powered by modern engines. Ottoman officials placed orders for 2 such battleships, hoping these vessels would restore national pride and serve as a deterrent against rivals like Greece and Russia. Crucially, these ships were not gifts. The Ottoman public helped fund them through nationwide donations. Farmers, shopkeepers, and civil servants contributed money, believing these ships symbolized not just military strength, but the future survival of their state. The battleships became a matter of national honor, yet in London, the situation was viewed through a very different lens. As Europe edged closer to war, British policymakers grew increasingly anxious. Germany's rapid naval expansion had already triggered an arms race with Britain. The possibility that 2 advanced battleships, built in British yards, might fall into Ottoman hands raised uncomfortable questions. What if the Ottomans aligned with Britain's enemies? What if these ships were used against British interests in the Mediterranean? In July 1914, those fears intensified. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set off a chain reaction of mobilizations and ultimatums across Europe. Britain, though not immediately at war, began preparing for the worst. Naval supremacy was central to its defense strategy, and no risks could be tolerated. Then came the decision that would echo across the Middle East for generations. In August 1914, as war erupted, Britain seized the Ottoman battleships still under construction. The ships were absorbed into the Royal Navy, renamed, and placed under British command. Legally justified under wartime emergency powers, the seizure was strategically logical from London's perspective, but in Istanbul, it was perceived as a betrayal. The Ottomans had paid for the ships. Their people had sacrificed to fund them. And now, at the moment they were needed most, Britain had taken them without compensation. Newspapers across the empire erupted in outrage. Public trust in Britain collapsed almost overnight. This single act did more than cancel a naval contract, it shattered a fragile diplomatic relationship. At the same time, Germany moved swiftly to exploit the situation. 2 German warships, pursued by the Royal Navy, fled into Ottoman waters and were symbolically transferred to Ottoman control. Though still crewed by Germans, they were presented as a gesture of respect and partnership. To many in the Ottoman leadership, the contrast was clear. Britain had taken. Germany had given. Within weeks, the Ottoman Empire drifted decisively toward the Central Powers, a move that would pull the Middle East into the First World War. What followed was not merely a military alliance, but a transformation of the region's political destiny. The closing of the Dardanelles disrupted global trade. Campaigns in Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, and Arabia reshaped borders and identities. The war's aftermath dismantled the Ottoman state entirely, replacing it with mandates, kingdoms, and conflicts that continue to shape the modern Middle East. Yet at the heart of this vast transformation lies a deceptively simple moment: two ships, built in British shipyards, never delivered to their intended owner. History often turns not on grand declarations, but on decisions made under pressure, decisions that seem practical at the time, yet unleash consequences far beyond their immediate purpose. Britain's seizure of the Ottoman battleships was one such decision. The summer of 1914 marked a turning point not only for Europe, but for the fate of the Middle East. In Istanbul, confusion and anger followed Britain's seizure of the Ottoman battleships. What had begun as a diplomatic disappointment quickly transformed into a crisis of trust. The Ottoman leadership now faced a stark reality: neutrality might no longer be enough to preserve the empire. At the heart of this uncertainty stood a divided government. The empire was formally ruled by Sultan Mehmed V, but real power lay with the Committee of Union and Progress, often called the Young Turks. This group believed that survival depended on decisive action, modernization, and strong alliances. For them, the seizure of the battleships was not an isolated incident, it was proof that Britain could not be relied upon. Germany, by contrast, had spent years cultivating influence within the Ottoman military. German officers trained Ottoman troops, reorganized command structures, and advised on modernization. These efforts were not driven by friendship alone. Berlin understood that Ottoman territory controlled vital choke points, especially the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. As British trust collapsed, German opportunity expanded. In early August 1914, two German warships, the SMS Goeben and SMS Breslau, were being hunted across the Mediterranean by the Royal Navy. Their mission was simple: avoid destruction and, if possible, alter the strategic balance. What followed became one of the most dramatic naval chases of the early war. Against expectations, the German ships reached the Dardanelles. Ottoman authorities faced a critical decision. Allowing foreign warships through the straits risked violating neutrality and provoking Britain and France. Yet refusing entry might mean pushing Germany away at a moment when allies were desperately needed. The ships were allowed in. Soon after, the German vessels were officially transferred to the Ottoman Navy. They were renamed, Ottoman flags were raised, and ceremonies were staged to emphasize the symbolic nature of the act. In reality, German crews remained in command. But perception mattered more than technical truth. To the Ottoman public, Germany had replaced what Britain had taken. This moment reshaped political momentum in Istanbul. The presence of modern warships dramatically strengthened Ottoman naval capabilities overnight. More importantly, it strengthened the argument of those who favored alignment with Germany. The message was clear: Germany respected Ottoman sovereignty, while Britain acted only in its own interest. Throughout September and October 1914, diplomatic maneuvering intensified. Officially, the Ottoman Empire remained neutral. Unofficially, German advisors gained influence, naval patrols increased, and preparations for war accelerated. The empire was drifting toward conflict, not through a single declaration, but through a series of calculated steps. Then, in late October, the point of no return was crossed. Ottoman warships, commanded by German officers, launched attacks against Russian ports in the Black Sea. The bombardments were brief but decisive. Russia responded with a declaration of war, followed quickly by Britain and France. The Ottoman Empire was now formally part of the World War I. This entry into the war was not universally supported within the empire. Many officials feared disaster, believing the state was unprepared for industrial-scale conflict. Their fears were well-founded. The Ottoman military now faced multiple fronts: the Caucasus against Russia, Mesopotamia against Britain, the Suez Canal, Arabia, and the Dardanelles. Naval power, once seen as a path to security, became a catalyst for total war. For Britain, Ottoman entry changed everything. The closure of the Dardanelles cut Russia off from vital supply routes. Grain exports halted, ammunition shortages grew, and pressure mounted on the Allied leadership to reopen the straits. The result was the ill-fated Gallipoli campaign, one of the most costly and controversial operations of the war. Gallipoli was more than a military campaign. It was the direct consequence of decisions made years earlier, of ships seized, alliances shifted, and trust broken. The naval question that once seemed secondary now dominated strategic planning. Meanwhile, across the Middle East, British policymakers began thinking beyond the war itself. Ottoman control was no longer assumed to survive the conflict. Plans were drawn to reshape the region after victory, laying the groundwork for future mandates, borders, and rivalries. Promises were made to Arab leaders. Secret agreements were signed with France. Maps were redrawn in anticipation of Ottoman collapse. All of this traced back to the moment when the empire chose Germany over Britain. For the Ottomans, the war became a struggle for survival. Victory at Gallipoli brought pride and temporary security, but elsewhere defeats mounted. Resources dwindled, famine spread, and internal dissent grew. The empire was being consumed by the very conflict it had entered in hopes of preserving itself. By 1918, the outcome was unavoidable. The Ottoman Empire surrendered, ending more than 6 centuries of imperial rule. What followed was not peace, but transformation. New states emerged. Old identities were fractured. And the Middle East entered a new era defined by foreign influence and unresolved tensions. In retrospect, it is tempting to see this outcome as inevitable. But history rarely unfolds so simply. The Ottoman decision to side with Germany was shaped by emotion as much as strategy, by humiliation as much as calculation. Britain's seizure of the battleships did not cause the empire's collapse on its own, but it removed the last barrier between neutrality and war. When the guns of the First World War finally fell silent in late 1918, the Middle East did not enter an era of peace. Instead, it stepped into a period of uncertainty shaped by secret agreements, imperial ambitions, and decisions made far from the region itself. For Britain and its allies, victory over the Ottoman Empire presented both opportunity and responsibility. For the people of the former empire, it marked the beginning of a new struggle, one whose consequences are still felt today. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire was swift and final. Centuries of rule ended not with a single battle, but with exhaustion, famine, and defeat on multiple fronts. Istanbul was occupied by Allied forces, Ottoman institutions were dismantled, and the empire that once connected 3 continents ceased to exist. Yet the end of Ottoman rule did not mean independence for its former territories. Even before the war had ended, Britain and France had secretly agreed on how to divide much of the Ottoman Middle East. The Sykes-Picot Agreement laid out artificial zones of control, ignoring ethnic, religious, and historical realities on the ground. Lines drawn on paper in European offices would soon become borders enforced by armies. These plans came into force after the war through a system known as the Mandates. Under the authority of the League of Nations, former Ottoman territories were placed under British and French administration, supposedly to prepare them for self-rule. In practice, the Mandates extended imperial influence under a different name. Britain emerged as the dominant power across much of the region. It assumed control over Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine, territories of immense strategic value. Oil resources, trade routes, and access to India all played a role in shaping British priorities. Naval considerations, once again, were never far from decision-making. The same maritime logic that had driven Britain to seize Ottoman battleships now influenced how it governed the region. Control of ports, canals, and coastlines remained essential to maintaining imperial security. The Middle East was no longer an Ottoman buffer, it was a critical link in Britain's global system, but governance proved far more difficult than conquest. In Iraq, resistance erupted almost immediately. Local populations rejected foreign rule, forcing Britain into costly military campaigns to maintain control. In Palestine, conflicting promises made during the war, to Arab leaders and to Zionist organizations, created tensions that would harden into one of the world's most enduring conflicts. Across the region, expectations of independence collided with the reality of mandate rule. Many Arabs had supported the Allied war effort believing it would bring freedom after Ottoman collapse. Instead, they found themselves under new masters, governed by unfamiliar laws and distant authorities. For Britain, the irony was profound. The seizure of Ottoman battleships had been intended to protect imperial interests and maintain stability. Yet the chain of events it helped set in motion produced decades of unrest, rebellion, and strategic overreach. The Middle East became not a secure asset, but a constant challenge. Meanwhile, the former heart of the empire underwent its own transformation. Out of the ruins of Ottoman defeat emerged a revolutionary movement led by Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. Rejecting both foreign occupation and imperial tradition, he led a successful struggle that resulted in the founding of the Republic of Turkey. Unlike much of the former empire, Turkey retained sovereignty, but only after profound political and cultural change. The naval question, once central to Ottoman survival, faded into history. But its legacy remained embedded in the geopolitical order that replaced the empire. Control of waterways, access to seas, and dependence on foreign powers continued to shape regional politics. By the early 1920s, the map of the Middle East bore little resemblance to what had existed before 1914. New states had been created, but few enjoyed true independence. Borders divided communities. Mandate administrations prioritized stability over representation. And resentment toward foreign intervention grew steadily. Historians continue to debate whether the outcome could have been different. Had Britain delivered the battleships, might the Ottoman Empire have remained neutral? Would neutrality have spared the Middle East from becoming a primary theater of war? Or were the forces of nationalism, imperial rivalry, and global conflict already too powerful to resist? What is clear is that decisions made in moments of crisis carry consequences far beyond their immediate context. Britain's naval seizure was rational within the logic of wartime strategy. But strategy rarely accounts for emotion, perception, or memory. In Istanbul, the act was remembered not as necessity, but as humiliation. That memory influenced alliances. Alliances shaped wars. Wars reshaped borders. The modern Middle East was not created by a single treaty or battle. It emerged through a series of interconnected choices, some deliberate, others reactive. The fate of empires turned not only on armies and economies, but on trust in its collapse. Today, when conflicts erupt across the region, their origins are often traced back to the post-First World War settlements. Mandate borders, unresolved national aspirations, and external intervention form a historical foundation that remains unstable. Understanding this history does not offer easy solutions. But it does reveal an essential truth: the present is inseparable from the past. The story of Britain and the Ottoman Navy is not merely about ships and sea power. It is about how decisions made to protect an empire helped dismantle another, and in doing so, altered the destiny of an entire region. A century has passed since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, yet its shadow still stretches across the modern Middle East. Borders drawn in the aftermath of war continue to shape politics, identities, and conflicts. The decisions that dismantled one empire and extended another did not fade with time, they hardened into structures that define the present. Among those decisions, Britain's handling of naval power stands as a revealing case study. At the start of the 20th century, Britain believed that control of the seas guaranteed global stability. This belief was not without foundation. Maritime dominance had built and sustained the British Empire, enabling trade, communication, and military reach across continents. Protecting that dominance was considered essential, even if it required unilateral action. The seizure of the Ottoman battleships reflected this mindset. It was a tactical decision rooted in immediate wartime logic. Yet history shows that tactical victories can produce strategic consequences far beyond their intent. What Britain gained in naval security, it lost in influence, trust, and long-term stability. The Ottoman reaction revealed a deeper truth: power is not measured solely by weapons or fleets, but by perception. To Ottoman leaders and citizens alike, the confiscation symbolized disrespect and vulnerability. It confirmed fears that the empire's fate would be decided by others unless decisive action was taken. That perception helped drive the Ottomans into war, and into collapse. In the decades that followed, Britain found itself repeatedly confronting the outcomes of that collapse. Governing the Middle East required constant military presence, diplomatic maneuvering, and economic investment. Far from stabilizing the region, imperial oversight often intensified tensions. The legacy of these decisions became especially visible in the mid-20th century, as colonial structures unraveled. Newly independent states inherited borders that rarely reflected social realities. Many faced immediate challenges: contested legitimacy, fragile institutions, and unresolved territorial disputes. Naval power, however, did not disappear from the equation. Strategic waterways such as the Suez Canal, the Bosphorus, and the Strait of Hormuz became focal points of global politics. Control of these routes remained vital to trade and energy security, linking regional stability to international interests. The logic that once drove Britain's naval decisions continues to influence global strategy today. For modern powers, the lesson is sobering. Military superiority can secure short-term objectives, but it cannot substitute for political legitimacy. The British experience in the Middle East demonstrated that influence imposed without consent often breeds resistance rather than order. This dynamic has repeated itself across generations, involving new actors but familiar patterns. The end of the British Empire did not erase these challenges. Instead, it passed them on to successor states and international institutions. Conflicts rooted in Mandate-era decisions resurfaced repeatedly, from regional wars to ongoing territorial disputes. Historians increasingly view the early 20th century as a turning point when global systems shifted from empires to nation-states, without fully resolving the contradictions between them. The Ottoman collapse was among the most consequential of these transitions, precisely because it occurred at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Britain's role in that collapse was neither uniquely malicious nor entirely accidental. It was the product of strategic thinking shaped by imperial priorities. Yet acknowledging context does not negate consequence. The long-term effects of imperial decisions cannot be separated from the instability that followed. In Turkey, memory of this era remains complex. The founding of the Republic of Turkey represented both liberation and loss, freedom from imperial decay, but separation from a multinational past. Turkish historical narratives often emphasize resilience and renewal, while recalling foreign intervention as a cautionary tale. Across the Arab world, the legacy is more fragmented. National identities emerged under external pressure, shaped by borders that often cut across shared histories. Political movements, revolutions, and reform efforts have repeatedly sought to reclaim agency denied during the Mandate period. In each case, the origins trace back to a moment when global war intersected with imperial decline. The story of Britain and the Ottoman Navy reminds us that history is not driven solely by inevitability. Individual decisions, made under stress, guided by doctrine, constrained by fear, can redirect the course of regions and peoples. The seizure of two battleships did not by itself create the modern Middle East, but it helped tip a fragile balance. Today's policymakers face similar dilemmas. Security concerns, alliance politics, and strategic choke points still dominate global thinking. The temptation to prioritize immediate advantage over long-term consequence remains strong. History offers no simple prescriptions, but it does offer perspective. The early 20th century teaches that power exercised without empathy can undermine its own objectives. That alliances shaped by resentment are unstable. And that regions subjected to external design rarely conform to imposed order. Understanding the past does not mean reliving it, but it can prevent its repetition. As the Middle East continues to evolve, its challenges cannot be separated from the legacy of empire and war. The decisions that altered its course were made by people convinced they were acting rationally, even responsibly. Their failure lay not in calculation, but in imagination, in their inability to foresee how deeply those choices would resonate. The sea once connected empires and carried their fleets across the world. Today, it carries memory as well. The story of Britain, the Ottoman Navy, and the decision that altered the Middle East is not confined to history books. It lives on in borders, institutions, and conflicts that define our present. To understand the modern world, we must look not only at what was done, but at what was lost when trust sank beneath the waves. History does not end when treaties are signed or empires collapse. Instead, it continues, reshaped, reinterpreted, and carried forward into new generations. The story of Britain, the Ottoman Navy, and the decision that altered the Middle East did not conclude in 1918, nor in the Mandate era that followed. Its consequences continue to surface in modern geopolitics, often in ways that are subtle, indirect, and deeply embedded in global systems. In the 21st century, the Middle East remains one of the most strategically significant regions in the world. Its importance is no longer defined solely by imperial ambition, but by energy resources, trade routes, and regional power balances. Yet the logic that governs international engagement with the region still echoes the age of empires. Naval power remains central to this equation. From the eastern Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, maritime routes continue to determine economic stability and political leverage. The Bosphorus and Dardanelles, once guarded by Ottoman forts and later contested by Allied fleets, are today governed under international conventions, yet remain critical choke points linking continents and markets. Modern Turkey, successor to the Ottoman heartland, occupies a position shaped directly by its imperial past. Control of these straits grants it strategic relevance far beyond its borders. Decisions made during the empire's final years continue to define its diplomatic posture and security concerns. This continuity highlights a crucial lesson: geography endures, even when empires do not. Britain, no longer an imperial power, still feels the legacy of its earlier choices. The Middle East remains intertwined with British foreign policy, whether through alliances, military involvement, or historical responsibility. Debates within Britain about intervention, restraint, and accountability often return, implicitly or explicitly, to the era when the region was first reshaped under British influence. Other global powers now occupy roles once held by empires. The United States, Russia, and regional actors project power into the same strategic spaces once contested by Britain, Germany, and the Ottomans. Their fleets patrol familiar waters. Their policymakers confront similar dilemmas: how to secure interests without provoking instability, how to manage alliances shaped by history, and how to avoid repeating the errors of the past. The comparison is not exact, but it is instructive. Like Britain in 1914, modern powers often act under pressure, guided by short-term security concerns. Naval deployments, sanctions, and strategic partnerships are justified as necessary measures. Yet history warns that actions taken without regard for local perception can harden resentment and limit long-term influence. The Ottoman experience offers a powerful example. The empire did not enter World War I because it sought global domination. It entered because it felt cornered, humiliated, and strategically vulnerable. The seizure of the battleships symbolized a loss of agency, a moment when sovereignty seemed conditional rather than absolute. That sense of grievance resonates beyond its historical context. Across the modern Middle East, narratives of external interference continue to shape political identity. Foreign decisions, even when framed as stabilizing or protective, are often interpreted through a historical lens colored by imperial memory. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. This is why the study of early 20th century decisions remains relevant. Understanding how naval power influenced diplomacy, and how diplomacy shaped war, provides insight into today's international system. It reveals that military strength alone cannot guarantee political success. Influence depends on credibility, consistency, and respect for local agency. The story also challenges simplistic explanations of regional instability. The Middle East was not destined for conflict by culture or religion. Its modern struggles emerged from a specific historical sequence: imperial decline, global war, and externally imposed political frameworks. The Ottoman collapse was one chapter in that sequence, but a foundational one. By examining moments like Britain's seizure of Ottoman battleships, we see how seemingly limited decisions can trigger cascading effects. A contract dispute became a diplomatic rupture. A naval calculation became a political realignment. A regional war became a global turning point. Such chains of consequence are not unique to the past. In an interconnected world, decisions made in one capital can reshape lives thousands of miles away. The speed of modern communication amplifies this effect, but the underlying principle remains unchanged. Power exercised without foresight carries risk. For historians, the value of this story lies not in assigning blame, but in understanding process. How do states make decisions under uncertainty? How do material considerations intersect with emotion and identity? And how does history remember actions differently than those who carried them out? For audiences today, the relevance is immediate. Conflicts in the Middle East are often discussed as contemporary crises, detached from deeper context. Yet each crisis is layered upon older foundations. Recognizing those foundations does not solve present problems, but it reframes them. The Ottoman Navy, once a symbol of decline, has become a symbol of transition. It marks the moment when an old imperial order gave way to a new, unstable system. Britain's decision, pragmatic in isolation, became transformative in combination with wider forces. As we look forward, the challenge is not to undo history, but to learn from it. Empires fall. Alliances shift. Technology changes. But the human dimensions of power, trust, perception, dignity, remain constant. Ignoring them has consequences. Whether in 1914 or today, the sea still connects nations. Ships still project influence. And decisions made on distant horizons still ripple outward. The story of Britain, the Ottoman Navy, and the decision that altered the Middle East reminds us that history is not only about what happened, but about how those events continue to shape the choices we face now. In understanding the past, we gain not certainty, but clarity, and sometimes, clarity is the most powerful legacy history can offer. History often speaks most clearly when it is examined not as a sequence of events, but as a pattern of choices. The story of Britain, the Ottoman Navy, and the decision that altered the Middle East offers such a pattern, one that extends beyond empires and into the logic of modern global power. At its core, this story is about decision-making under uncertainty. In 1914, British leaders acted in a world defined by fear of encirclement, naval rivalry, and the looming reality of total war. The seizure of Ottoman battleships was not reckless, it was calculated. Within the framework of imperial strategy, it made sense. Britain believed that control of advanced naval technology was essential to survival, yet history demonstrates that strategic logic is never complete on its own. The decision failed to account for how deeply symbolic power matters, especially to declining states struggling to preserve dignity and autonomy. For the Ottoman Empire, the battleships represented hope, modernization, and international recognition. Losing them was not just a military setback, it was a psychological blow. This imbalance, between how a decision is intended and how it is received, forms the first enduring lesson. Modern states continue to face similar dilemmas. Military aid, sanctions, arms sales, and strategic interventions are often justified through security calculations. But the recipients of those actions interpret them through history, memory, and identity. What appears defensive to one side can appear humiliating or aggressive to the other. The Ottoman response reminds us that perception can override material reality. The empire did not suddenly gain overwhelming naval strength from the German ships that entered the Dardanelles. What it gained was reassurance, proof that at least one great power treated it as a partner rather than a liability. That reassurance tipped the balance toward war. From this emerges a second lesson: alliances are built as much on trust as on capability. Britain possessed overwhelming naval power, but it lacked credibility in Ottoman eyes at a critical moment. Germany, though weaker at sea, capitalized on that gap. The result was a strategic reversal that reshaped the First World War and the Middle East. In the modern era, alliance politics remain fragile. States rarely choose partners based solely on shared values. They choose based on reliability, on who delivers when it matters. The Ottoman case illustrates how quickly alliances can shift when trust erodes, even if long-term consequences are catastrophic. The third lesson lies in the unintended consequences of short-term decisions. Britain's seizure of the battleships aimed to reduce risk. Instead, it expanded the war geographically, pulled the Middle East into global conflict, and forced Britain to commit vast resources to campaigns it had not initially sought. Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, and Palestine became direct outcomes of that earlier choice. History repeatedly shows that preventive actions can provoke the very threats they seek to avoid. This pattern is visible across centuries, from imperial rivalries to modern security dilemmas. When states act to preempt danger without considering political fallout, they often create new, more complex challenges. The fourth lesson is structural rather than emotional. Empires, by their nature, prioritize systems over societies. Britain viewed the Ottoman Empire as part of a strategic environment, an element in a global balance of power. Ottoman leaders viewed themselves as guardians of a civilization under siege. These perspectives were never fully compatible. When empires make decisions about regions rather than peoples, instability follows. The mandate system that replaced Ottoman rule reflected this same structural flaw. Borders were drawn to serve administrative efficiency and strategic convenience, not social cohesion. The result was long-term fragility that outlived imperial rule itself. This brings us to a broader historical truth. the end of empires rarely resolves the problems they create. Instead, those problems are transferred, embedded in institutions, borders, and political cultures. The Middle East inherited the consequences of decisions made during imperial decline, including the naval decision that helped trigger Ottoman entry into war. Even today, debates about sovereignty, intervention, and regional security echo the same questions faced a century ago: who controls strategic waterways, who guarantees security, who decides when necessity justifies intervention? These questions have no permanent answers, but history offers guidance. The Ottoman Navy's story teaches that power exercised without empathy undermines stability. That technological superiority cannot substitute for legitimacy. And that states under pressure often act irrationally, not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack viable alternatives. Perhaps the most important lesson is the simplest: history is interconnected. The seizure of two battleships cannot be isolated from the collapse of an empire, the redrawing of borders, or the conflicts that followed. Each decision existed within a chain of cause and effect. Breaking one link reshaped the entire chain. For modern audiences, this perspective matters deeply. It challenges narratives that portray current Middle Eastern instability as ancient or inevitable. Instead, it reveals a modern origin, rooted in industrial war, imperial competition, and diplomatic miscalculation. Understanding this does not absolve present actors of responsibility, but it restores agency to history. It shows that outcomes were shaped by choices, not destiny. As naval power continues to evolve, through aircraft carriers, submarines, and emerging technologies, the lesson remains relevant. Control of the seas still matters. But so does control of narrative, trust, and perception. The sea remembers what politics forgets. Ships rust and sink, empires rise and fall, but the consequences of decisions made in moments of crisis endure. The waters of the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Middle East carry the echoes of choices that reshaped the modern world. The story of Britain and the Ottoman Navy is ultimately not about blame. It is about awareness that power must be balanced with restraint, that security must be matched with respect, and that history, when ignored, has a way of returning, stronger and more demanding than before. In the final analysis, the decision that altered the Middle East was not a single act, but a failure to imagine its aftermath, and that may be the most enduring lesson of all. History does not live only in archives. It lives in classrooms, ceremonies, monuments, and national stories passed from one generation to the next. Long after the guns of the First World War fell silent, the memory of that conflict, and of the decisions that shaped it, continued to evolve. Nowhere is this more evident than in how Britain and the former Ottoman world remember the naval decision that helped alter the Middle East. Memory, unlike history, is selective. In Britain, the First World War is often remembered through sacrifice and endurance, the trenches of the Western Front, the scale of loss, and the eventual victory that preserved the nation. Naval decisions, though crucial, occupy a quieter place in public memory. The seizure of Ottoman battleships is rarely highlighted as a defining moment. When it is mentioned, it is framed as a wartime necessity, an example of prudent leadership in a dangerous moment. This framing reflects how states tend to remember themselves. National narratives prioritize coherence and justification. Decisions are interpreted through outcomes favorable to national identity. The broader consequences, especially those felt beyond national borders, often fade into abstraction. For Britain, the Middle East became one of many theaters in a global conflict, rather than a region whose future was fundamentally reshaped by imperial action. In the former Ottoman lands, memory took a different path. For Turkey, the final years of the empire are remembered as both tragedy and transformation. The collapse of Ottoman power is taught not simply as defeat, but as the prelude to renewal. Foreign intervention, naval seizures, occupations, and mandates is often remembered as evidence of imperial arrogance that justified resistance and reform. Within this narrative, the battleships symbolize more than lost steel. They represent a moment when sovereignty was exposed as fragile, when modernization efforts were undermined by external power. That symbolism endures precisely because it speaks to dignity rather than strategy. Across the Arab world, collective memory is more fragmented. The Ottoman period itself is remembered differently across regions, sometimes as imperial neglect, sometimes as relative stability. but the post-war settlement is widely recalled as a betrayal. Wartime promises of independence, followed by mandate rule, occupy a central place in historical consciousness. In this context, Britain's naval decision becomes part of a larger pattern, foreign powers deciding the region's fate without local consent. The specifics of ship contracts and naval strategy matter less than the broader impression they reinforce, that power was exercised from afar, with lasting consequences on the ground. This divergence in memory reveals a deeper dynamic. History is not just what happened, it is how meaning is assigned to what happened. The same decision can be remembered as rational necessity by one society and as injustice by another. Over time, these memories harden into myths, simplified stories that guide political identity. Myth does not mean falsehood. It means compression. Complex events are distilled into symbols: a ship seized, a treaty signed, a border drawn. These symbols become shorthand for broader experiences of loss or control. They influence how societies interpret present-day actions by foreign powers, often amplifying suspicion or defensiveness. This is why historical memory matters for contemporary politics. Modern interventions in the Middle East are rarely judged in isolation. They are evaluated against a backdrop of remembered history, imperial mandates, broken promises, and external control. Even when intentions differ, perception is shaped by precedent. The naval decision of 1914 thus survives not as a technical footnote, but as part of a collective narrative about power and vulnerability. Education plays a crucial role in sustaining these narratives. Textbooks, museums, and commemorations determine which events are emphasized and which are minimized. In Britain, imperial history has undergone reassessment in recent decades, prompting debates about responsibility and legacy. In Turkey and across the Middle East, historical education often foregrounds resistance and resilience, reinforcing national cohesion in the face of past subjugation. Neither approach is neutral. Every society chooses which lessons to emphasize. Some highlight caution and sacrifice. Others emphasize injustice and recovery. These choices shape how future generations understand international relations, and how they respond to crisis. The danger arises when memory replaces analysis. When historical myths are treated as complete explanations, they can limit dialogue. Resentment becomes fixed. Responsibility becomes absolute. The complexity of past decision-making is flattened into moral certainty. In such an environment, compromise becomes difficult, yet history, when studied carefully, resists simplicity. Britain's seizure of the battleships was neither purely malicious nor harmlessly pragmatic. It was a decision made under pressure, guided by doctrine, and blind to its wider resonance. Recognizing this complexity does not excuse its consequences, but it deepens understanding. Similarly, Ottoman alignment with Germany was not a reckless leap toward destruction. It was a response to perceived abandonment, shaped by limited options and urgent fear. Memory often judges outcomes, not circumstances. Understanding this distinction is essential. When nations engage with their past honestly, acknowledging both intention and impact, they create space for mutual recognition. This does not erase harm, but it contextualizes it. It replaces accusation with explanation. In recent years, historians and educators have increasingly emphasized connected histories, approaches that trace how decisions in one place ripple outward. This perspective aligns closely with the story of Britain and the Ottoman Navy. It shows how a naval calculation in Europe reshaped political realities thousands of miles away. Such understanding carries a practical lesson for the present. In a globalized world, no major decision remains local. Economic sanctions, military alliances, and security interventions all generate memories that outlast their immediate goals. Future relationships are shaped not just by outcomes, but by how actions are remembered. The sea once carried fleets that enforced imperial order. Today, it carries trade, communication cables, and shared vulnerability. Yet the past travels with it. If the modern world is to avoid repeating the mistakes of the early 20th century, it must take memory seriously, not as grievance, but as context. History cannot be undone, but it can be understood more fully. The story of Britain, the Ottoman Navy, and the decision that altered the Middle East endures because it speaks to universal themes: power and pride, fear and trust, action and consequence. Its lessons are not confined to one region or one era. They belong to anyone who seeks to understand how the past continues to shape the present, and how today's decisions will one day become someone else's memory. History rarely announces the moment when everything changes. There's no clear dividing line between cause and consequence, no signal that a single decision will echo across generations. And yet, from time to time, history leaves behind a quiet marker, a moment that, in hindsight, reveals how fragile the balance of the world truly was. The seizure of the Ottoman battleships in 1914 was one such moment. It was not an act of conquest, nor a declaration of war. It was a decision made in urgency, shaped by fear and strategic doctrine. To Britain, it was a safeguard. To the Ottoman Empire, it was a warning that survival would require choosing sides in a world that no longer tolerated neutrality. From that choice flowed a chain of events that reshaped the Middle East. War followed. Empires collapsed. Borders were drawn. New states were born into uncertainty. And the region entered a century defined by external influence, internal struggle, and unresolved identity. What makes this story endure is not its scale, but its simplicity. 2 ships, never delivered, became symbols of trust lost and paths taken. They remind us that power does not operate in isolation. Every decision is received, interpreted, remembered. And those memories shape the future as surely as armies or treaties. Today, the Middle East stands at another crossroads. Different powers, new technologies, familiar anxieties. The context has changed, but the underlying lesson remains: stability cannot be imposed without understanding, and security cannot be built on humiliation. The sea still carries ships across the same waters. But it also carries history, and history asks only one thing of the present: that we listen, because the greatest decisions are often not the loudest ones.